All right, generous theology. This is Brock. I'm with my friend Chuck. Chuck,
Hey,
I'm
Brock.
Excited. Good to see you, my friend.
Good to see
We're
you too.
in a new year, but we have a chance to work with Bavinck, and we have a chance to start a second chapter, chapter 2. And Chuck, the contrast between this chapter and the first chapter sometimes throws people for a loop. And let me explain for our listeners. We spent so much time in chapter 1 talking about the hiddenness of God, the divine incomprehensibility. We spent so much time talking about arguments for why God is so foreign to us. And now in chapter 2, we're sort of going to play the other end of the pool, as it were, and maybe give back a lot of what we took in the first chapter. Now, I mean, that's how people can see it, Chuck. I don't think there's a contradiction here to say that God is hidden from us in some sense, and yet we can talk about knowledge of him. But Chuck, it's fair to acknowledge that this is often a confusing point for people. What comes to your mind when you think about trying to square that circle?
Yeah, there is a sense in which it seems at first incomprehensibility of God first, and then the knowledge of God second. Like, what? Wait, what? Are we? What are we doing here? We're kind of bouncing from one side to the other. But I think in some ways it makes sense, and I think Bavinck was smart to do it in the order that he did. See, the way I think this is kind of what I'm imagining going through Bavinck's mind as he's putting together. And we know that these were often lectures that he gave at the university and sort of as part of his classes. And then he sort of just kind of gathered them together to put the Dutch language version of this together. And I suspect that what he was doing here is focusing first of all on the incomprehensibility of God, because you need to set the stage for the idea that we as humans can't know everything. And in many ways, putting that chapter first is as much about our limitedness as human beings as it is about God being incomprehensible. So that now when we step to the next chapter and talk about the knowledge of God, where immediately we go to issues like revelation. And how do we know God? We know God through his self-revelation. What that enables us to do is hopefully to avoid the pitfalls of thinking, well, we know everything because God is, we can put him in our hand and we can know every single detail about him. No. God is incomprehensible to us humans, but he deigns to, reveal himself to us in particular ways. And that is how we gain that knowledge of God. So by putting things in that order, I think what he's done is also set sort of a priority for how do we talk about the knowledge of God here. So yeah, I think that was a smart move by Herman Bavinck.
Chuck, I love that starting point. And as we look at the beginning of the text here, I'm struck with the different world that I find myself in from the world Professor Bavinck is describing here in Pericope 167, the first essay or the first section in chapter 2. And Chuck, this really needs to be discussed. We need to talk about this. First of all, let's describe the layout and why it's so different. And second of all, let's try to account for this amazing turnabout in things. And so let me just set the stage and then throw it over to you to reflect on what a different world you and I are in today versus the world Professor Bavinck was in when he was teaching. And by that I mean this. You read this section, The Problem of Atheism, and it is clear that Professor Bavinck is in a world where atheism is almost unthinkable. It is a small minority position, hardly held by anyone. Only a very few people in the culture really espouse it or champion it, let's put it that way. And this is, he can write things like he does in this section. It's unthinkable to be an atheist. I think that's one of the quotes from Cicero that Professor Bavinck is thinking about in the society that he's in. And yet, just 120 years-ish later, Chuck, you and I are in a society that is perhaps almost inverted. Now, I don't wish to say that Christianity is today what atheism was in Professor Bavinck's day, but it's clear that atheism, far from being relegated to this very small backwater fringe that's not even worth considering in Professor Bavinck's day, it is a very important minority position in the culture today, if it's not a majority position, which I think is open for discussion. But the point is, Chuck, what has happened, and what does that imply for Professor Bavinck's analysis in light of these staggering changes? And what were your thoughts, Chuck, when you were reading that? Were you struck by the complete inversion of what we were reading versus what we're living today? And if so, where was your mind going?
Yeah, I think I read that on two levels. The first level is sort of the immediate, who claims to be an atheist. And you're right. I think 120 years ago, when Bavinck was writing and when he was teaching at the university, even in Europe, even in Germany and the Netherlands, it is fair to say that atheism would have been a very uncommon position. And if it wasn't completely untenable for reasonable people to hold, it was still pretty hard. And there were various reasons for that. Some of them related more to the culture than they did to philosophical thinking, but in many ways it also dealt with sort of the philosophies of the day as well. That they were not particularly atheistic; they were reductionistic when it came to who God is. They were perhaps focused on the importance of the individual or of humans, but you're right. Atheism was not common. Today it is much more common, and it's interesting that even things that we've seen happen in our own lifetimes. I was thinking back. I was looking back at the last recording that we did on when we discussed Bavinck, when we discussed the end of chapter 1 of volume 2, and at the end of that I showed a picture of myself from about 1989, and prior to 1989, prior to the fall of communism, I think in the West, even in Europe, although perhaps less so in Europe, even up to then, atheism was a strange concept, and most people wouldn't even claim to be atheist. I remember a high school teacher of mine. This would have probably been more in the mid 80s, but a high school teacher of mine saying there are no atheists, there are agnostics, but there are no atheists, and pointing out that many people who claimed to be atheists turned out to actually be agnostics. But even today, that and part of that again may have been, before the fall of communism, atheism was seen as sort of related to communism, right? The atheists, they're all in those communist countries behind the Iron Curtain. Today, that's not the case. There isn't necessarily, in fact, some of those communist countries, China is the fastest growing Christian country in the world. It's still behind the Iron Curtain in a way. It's still sort of a communist country, and we see the growth of sort of a strange form of Christianity, Orthodox Christianity in Russia today with Putin, and making argument his invasion of Ukraine is sort of partially based in some of these sort of religious sort of beliefs. So atheism isn't a real popular thing in Russia today, but here in the U.S. and especially in Europe, much more so. And a lot more people who claim to it. And, in the last 10 years, a lot of writing has been done, a lot of popular books that are sort of defending this idea of atheism. Now, there is another level to this, I think, which is regardless of what was going on in the world when Bavinck was writing, I think there are some of his arguments that still hold true, that still make sense today, including some of his arguments that atheism isn't as real a thing as even some atheists think it to be. And that gets into some of the issues. Like he makes a comment, taken in an absolute sense as the denial of an absolute power, atheism is almost unthinkable. In the final analysis, all people again recognize a power that they venerate as God. Now, what I would say is that today there are a lot more people who would argue that no, that's not God. We were not talking about God, but they still venerate some kind of power. What is that power? It might be the power of community, or it might be the power of democracy, or it might be the power of critical theories, or various and sundry ideas that people may have that are sort of what the power that they believe in. But it needs to be pointed out that is still a power, and that religion isn't limited to deism. There can be non-deistic religions in which the real power of that religion in many ways takes the place of God. So it's not really atheistic in the way that people try to say that it is. And it's interesting, just yesterday, and not in preparation for this chapter, I was having a kind of a fun discussion in my youth group. And I've talked a little bit here about my youth group. I got some really smart kids in there, and we're reading a book that kind of goes through this concept of creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. And so we were in the chapter on redemption this week, and Cornelius Plantinga is the author of the book. He's related to the famous philosopher Alvin Plantinga, I believe. But anyway, Cornelius Plantinga, who's a pretty well-known theologian, wrote this book. And one of the things that Plantinga did, this is a book that is aimed primarily at first-year college students. And so my high school kids are a little younger than that, but I got some really smart ones, so I figured they could handle it. And one of the things that Plantinga does in this book is he plants quotes in the middle of the pages that he doesn't necessarily refer to, but they really add to what you're talking about. It's a great pedagogical technique, because I love being able to point to this quote and say, students, why do you think Professor Plantinga might have put this quote here? So we were talking about a quote, and it's from Friedrich Nietzsche. And I don't have the quote in front of me. I wish I would have thought of this before we started up, but I've got my book downstairs. But basically, Nietzsche makes the statement that if you don't believe in God, or if you don't believe in important things about God, it all falls away. And in the end, you believe in nothing, and there can be nothing. There can be no moral code. There can be, no sort of unified way of thinking about the world. And one of my students, even before we got to that, I always start with, hey, was there anything in the chapter that you want to talk about? And one of my students, David, raised his hand and said, what about this quote? Was a really interesting quote. And he kind of held forth a little bit about it. And I agreed with him. The interesting thing, I think, is that, and we've talked a little bit about Nietzsche, and I'd be interested in your take, because you're more expert on some of these philosophers than I am. But I think with Nietzsche, after him, there has come to be those who sort of took Nietzsche to the next level and basically said, yeah, Nietzsche said that, and he was right. There is no God, and there is no moral code, and there is no nothing. And, it's just nihilism all the way. And I pointed out to my student, who thought this sounded like a wonderful Christian quote, which, by the way, is a great quote for us to use as Christians. But I pointed out that some people take that other way. And in fact, there's a sense in which some of the excesses of, for example, the Nazis are built on some of this philosophy. But it is interesting that even, it's a little longer ago than 120 years ago, I think, that Nietzsche was writing. But Nietzsche recognized this same thing, pointed it out, and yet his followers have tried to take it to the end of where, hey, yeah, it is nihilism. We don't believe in anything. Well, you know what? Even nihilism has a power that we worship as God. If we are going to hold to that, it might be the conviction and the power that there is nothing, nothing that we can live for, and so let's just do whatever we want. It might be the sense that you have to create power in order to you create power. That's the only way you can possibly live, is by realistically creating that power, or whatever it is. That is still not truly atheism. And I think we can point out to people who try to be atheists a quote like that, which I think does begin to put paid to the idea that you really can be an atheist, that it is logically almost impossible to truly be an atheist. And so Bavinck's argument there, even though he's making it at a time when people weren't really saying they were atheists, I think still holds water today. What do you think? Does that make sense, or am I sort of misconstruing, do you think?
No, I love how you framed that, Chuck. I think one of the things that is striking here is, in pointing out this change, we're pointing out the swing in the culture. So we are describing a landscape that has changed. And we're noting how people think and how people identify in today's time versus just 120 years ago in Professor Bavinck's time. I don't think in saying this, you and I are ceding territory. I don't think we are giving up and saying something's happened and really Christianity didn't make it, didn't survive. Now, having said that, I think we have to qualify what we're talking about, because I think to many atheists, the last 15 years especially, atheists are saying, what do you mean? Christianity has been so largely replaced in the culture. And I think that's right. But I think that's a different story than the metaphysics of atheism have improved, or the metaphysics of Christianity have been refuted or debunked. Now, I want to just go through for fun, Chuck, and just talk about some of the language that Professor Bavinck goes through here, that we can see just what a different world it is that he's writing in. So in this first section here, he says, in an absolute sense, therefore, nothing is atheistic. There is no atheistic world. There are no atheistic people, nor are there atheistic persons. He says this: the world cannot be conceived as godless. And because of that, there are no atheistic or religious peoples. He says this, he cites Cicero: there is no people so barbarous as not to believe in the gods. And then he says in the next paragraph, there are no atheistic persons. A conscious theoretical atheism in an absolute sense, if it ever occurs, is rare. Now, he then goes down to say this: a nation, a society, a denomination or congregation of this kind of naturalists and pantheists is inconceivable and cannot exist. And so he talks about Schopenhauer, who says this: no one disbelieves. I'm sorry, this is not Schopenhauer, this is Augustine he's citing. No one disbelieves the existence of God except the person to whom God's existence is not convenient. Schopenhauer's statement is this: an impersonal God is no God at all. It is no more than a misused word, a misconception, a contradiction in terms. And so, Professor Bavinck's essay would be mocked, would be laughed, would be ridiculed today, I think. Professor Bavinck is a highly respected lecturer in the academy during his lifetime. And now I think if Professor Bavinck, if Chuck, you and I could go back in the time machine, grab Professor Bavinck from around 1894, 1895 or so, bring him back here for some guest lectures at our local university, I think the students would have something to say to him. Now, I don't believe that Professor Bavinck's metaphysics have been refuted, and I don't think that the underlying picture has changed. But what has changed? Well, for one thing, society has found a way to move creatively in this new secular sense. And without admitting that this refutes Christianity, I think it's worth admitting the power of this statement. Society has found a way in these times to move in a more secular direction. Now, that may or may not be metaphysically tenable, and you and I are going to present our arguments why it's not. But I think we can at least acknowledge that that shift has happened. And by the way, time and place sits im Leben, as we were talking about in our analysis of the Psalms. this, we're not speaking absolutely. I think probably you and I are thinking about the English-speaking world, even Professor Bavinck's Dutch-speaking world in the 1890s, where atheism is unthinkable. But that would not also represent that at the same time period there were places on the continent where atheism was much more accepted and acceptable. So it's happened. This inversion, this pole switch has happened, and now south is north and north is south, and it is almost becoming countercultural to be a Christian, and atheists are, and I'm not speaking here about the intellectual leaders of the atheist movement. I'm sort of speaking more about the rank and file folks, and the rank and file secularists of the day are sort of falling into all of the same kinds of fundamentalist dogmatisms that atheist brights were pointing out that Christians did back when Christians were in the majority. So what an interesting situation, an interesting shift. Now, one other aspect here, Chuck, and I know this is an arguable point, but one thing that has become clear to me, trying to assess atheism of the last 15 to 20 years in a generous sense, that I know is going to be controversial, but I'm going to say it anyway. Atheism, especially this new atheism of the last 20 years or so, in my mind, has proved itself to be a new religion. Now, how can the lack of belief in God be a religious situation? And it's up to us to show that, Chuck, and I accept that challenge. I'm just sharing privately that when I talk with my atheist friends, I see all the a priori pre-commitments that model or parallel religious faith in my atheist friends. So Christians committed to have been committed to this theistic worldview, this Christian worldview, this Christian metaphysics. Have atheists done better? Have they proved something further? Well, no, metaphysics has really not changed. What has changed is the comfort with which society is accepting of atheistic metaphysics. And this idea of naturalism, of science being the default, as if Christians somehow don't participate in science. But this idea that, well, no, we follow science here, as if that wasn't a metaphysical pre-commitment, as if the yay science crowd didn't stand on the shoulders of unproved dogmatic assumptions about reality, that instead of being theistic are now atheistic, typically materialistic. One of the things very few atheists will deny the existence of matter, although some may. But Chuck, what I've noticed is that there's commitments to uniformitarian processes that are impersonal, that are uncaused, that are unguided. You can think about the theory of evolution in the biological sciences as a good example of this. There's just no discussion in the sciences about scientific metaphysics regarding the origins of life. And when I say origins, I mean, the question that motivated people like Darwin to write their book. Now, the point is this: there really is a religious fervor. with the people that we're interacting with. And it's the religious fervor of someone who doesn't think they're religious in their fervor. And I wanted to point that out, Chuck, because I think that is just such a big deal. And for people who aren't well read on the history of such things, it really looks, there are young people, Chuck, you mentioned your youth group. There are young people, maybe let's say under 30, who are shocked to find out that a secularist, materialistic universe wasn't always the way things were thought of. And so we're kind of circling back here, Chuck, and I just want to sort of steep and savor in this tea of the reality that we live in, Chuck, that the world is so different today, and yet the same metaphysics, the same metaphysical arguments and approaches, I think, still have validity. So that was a long way to sort of circle around there, Chuck. What is your thought on this idea for the consequences for, let's say, the English-speaking West in the next 50, 60 years in light of this secular swing?
Yeah, and of course, in thinking about this secular swing, I think we have to think about where is it going, right? And I think Bavinck may have something even to say about that, even though he didn't recognize what that swing is. So I think actually the paragraph that you've got up that you're sharing right now is really helpful in this regard, because he talks about, first of all, there exists a practical atheism, life without God in the world. That is absolutely true. There are practical atheism is, I mean, there's probably a lot of Christians who are practical atheists, unfortunately. And so that piece of it, I think he already saw and he already recognized. Then we get to the idea of, well, then what about people who say, I am an atheist. I'm more than just simply a practical atheist. I really believe that there is no God. And Bavinck says here, the word atheism has often been used in a relative sense, not as the denial of any kind of deity, but as the denial of a certain specific deity. Now, I think there's some truth to that still today. When you look at people like Christopher Hawkins, or it's Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, sorry, I'll kind of mix the two, but famous atheists who've written popular books on atheism, it is very clear that for the most part, what they are atheistic about is the Christian God, right? They're not talking about, well, there's no power of nirvana in Buddhism, and there is no sort of Brahmic force, Confucianism. They don't care about any of that. To some, Islam maybe occasionally gets hit, and Judaism a little bit more, but it really is about, no, the Christian God doesn't exist. That's wrong. Now, to try to be consistent, they have to sort of make these atheistic arguments beyond just simply the Christian God doesn't exist, but that's a lot of what they are. And then I went, it was interesting while you were talking, I knew I had seen this somewhere. So on CNN, this got posted, I think almost 10 years ago. Yeah, December of 2015. So 9 years ago. And I believe I first saw this because there was, on CNN occasionally in the evenings, they do these shows that sort of talk about where we are in the world and in the culture. And they did something on religion and specifically about atheists. And they have, it's a slideshow, so, it's not as easy as just looking at a list, but they have famous atheists and their beliefs. And most of these are people, they're not necessarily the ivory tower type atheists. A lot of these are actors and other people in sort of the popular culture. And but a lot of those folks, while they say they're atheist, it's interesting how they put it. English actress Keira Knightley joked that she wishes she were Catholic. If only I was an atheist. She wishes she was Catholic. Well, so what does that mean? Actress Julianne Moore, in a 2002 interview on Inside the Actors Studio, she was asked what she would like to hear God say to her at the gates of heaven. And her reply was, well, I guess you were wrong. I do exist. Now, part of that was just sort of her mocking way of saying, see, God doesn't exist. But she could have answered it more straight, right? But instead she put words in God's mouth, almost as if, again, there is this hope that God exists, or there is this idea that there must be something there. Daniel Radcliffe, the guy who played Harry Potter, in a 2009 interview, he declared, I'm an atheist, but I'm very relaxed about it. I don't preach my atheism. I have a huge amount of respect for people who do. So again, sort of an admission that, yeah, I'm an atheist, but I don't know, can't really dive into the details. Another one, seems to be a fairly common one, Sir Richard Branson. He is the entrepreneur and founder of Virgin Airways and the Virgin Group. He had an interview with Piers Morgan, and he says, I believe in evolution and the importance of humanitarian efforts, but not in the existence of God. I would love to believe, he said. It's very comforting to believe. Okay, so that brings me to, so where does this go in our culture? And that gets to this idea of, practical atheism exists. There is a level at which there are always going to be, and perhaps more of them, people like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, who are going to make these sort of popular cases for atheism. Really, it's really anti the Christian God, but sort of disguised as atheism. And yet, in all of that, there is this longing. There is this desire. There's some people it comes out as I wish I could believe, and some people it comes out as I'm kind of relaxed about it, whatever. And others they would be like, yeah, it would be comforting. I'd like to believe. I just but they claim to be atheist, but yet there's something else going on there. Now, I think there are really two forms of atheism. And Bavinck addressed one of them. Bavinck talks about how in many ways what is called atheism is really a belief in naturalism, and naturalism takes the place of God. That's the deity, but people don't recognize it. And that's the science, right? And I think that's where a lot of the popular folks who are really pushing atheism come from, is sort of that way of thinking. And Bavinck recognizes that, and he sort of attacks that as even possible. The one that Bavinck, I don't think, really recognized is sort of a postmodern atheism. The idea that God doesn't exist because nothing is for sure. We can't really know anything. Nothing is knowable. Everything is unknowable. There are multiple truths. Now, if we go, the interesting thing is that those two forms of atheism are in many ways diametrically opposed, right? Because those who are really naturalistic, they actually do believe in truth. That truth that they believe in is a non-deistic truth, but they believe that empirically rationally we can determine what is true, and everything can sort of be gathered into, maybe there's this great theory of everything. We talked about that several years ago, that sort of in the end will explain everything. And so if we just search for that, we'll find it. By the way, that great theory of everything, it's called God. But anyway, so there's that side of it, and then there's the folks who just don't believe in anything. Now, I do think that to some extent our culture is moving down towards that more postmodern atheism. And in a postmodern atheism, at some point, if there can be no truth, and if everyone's truth is equally valid, if that's where we really go, I think we run into some problems, which is, well, then who decides? Is it majority rule? Do we just hold elections and whoever wins the day, that's what happens? But then what happens when it keeps switching sides? Does that mean that we're going to have one truth for a while and another truth for another while? And then what happens to the people who only hold one of those truths? What happens then? I think that's potentially a real problem. And I will say, while there are parts of postmodernism that I think we as Christians ought to think about and understand, and maybe even there are things we can learn from certain parts of postmodernism, postmodern atheism, I think, is bound to fall apart. I just don't think it's sustainable. It may take 50 years, but I have a feeling that my grandchildren, none of whom exist yet, none of whom even, they're not even being thought about necessarily yet, but I'm hoping to have them someday. I think by the time my grandchildren are my age, so, 60, 70 years from now, I think there's going to be enough of a change that either that idea of postmodern atheism has been turned around and we've gone back to a more theistic way of thinking, exactly what that theism might be, who knows, or that there is a sort of a push away from that, that non-truthiness and back towards more of a rationalistic, is it sort of just a back and forth between romanticism and rationalism, and this is just a continuation of that, and we start tilting back to that. I don't know which of those will happen. I certainly pray that at some point what it is that Christianity makes a comeback, and 70 years from now our churches are full, and I, by the way, I suspect if that happens, it's going to come from somewhere totally unexpected. It's not going to happen to start with in North America. It's going to happen in China or in some country in Africa or something, and that's where it's going to all come out of. But that's what I'm hopeful for. But I don't know which of those it is. But I am absolutely convinced of the untenability of postmodern atheism and the irrationality of rational atheism.
Chuck, what a way to really talk about this. And I love that speculation. I love how you've thought that through. And there's so much in there that I agree with. Especially exciting to me is the idea that God's going to do a new thing, and where that might come from. Being a student of history, being a student of the scriptures, we see that over and over again, the new thing is not just a carbon copy of the old thing. And that's exciting. Now, I want to share an interesting thought here. Let me share a tab. I was reading from this book by Peter Brown, the Rise of Western Christendom. And Peter Brown is one of the most important Augustine biographers. And reading this work was really interesting. One of the one of the things that comes out in Brown's discussion of Augustine's time. So Augustine is a theologian from North Africa, and North Africa at the time that he's living is undergoing exceptional cultural changes relating to the integration into Roman society. So the North Africans prior to Augustine's generation, give or take, largely thought of themselves not as Romans, as their own thing. I think Augustine himself was from a people who today we call the Berbers, which is, by the way, the name of the tribe from which we get the name barbarian, interestingly enough. But the point is Peter Brown paints a picture of Augustine and his generation in which Augustine is captured by this new emerging energetic Latin culture. So Rome has had militarily conquered North Africa and the entire Mediterranean world by this point for some time. But even though it's conquered, that doesn't mean that those cultures in the conquered territories just turn around and flip on a dime to being Roman. And so North Africa has its own identity for a long period. But by the time of Augustine's day, something in his generation really clicks. And Augustine goes to Rome. He becomes a Roman. The Latin culture, the Roman ethos, and not a North African ethos, drives him. It animates him. And not just him. Peter Brown talks about this being the spirit of the North Africans of that day. And so, where am I going with this? Well, the interesting thing is in that time period, it is Christianity that is the new modern thing. And it is Christianity that is reaching out and capturing societies, starting in the cities, starting in the academies, the schools. Of course, this is pre-university in the modern sense, but they had schools even back then, and academies and places for learning. And Christianity was capturing hearts and minds in the cosmopolitan places. And the places in the culture that were still holding on to the old ways tended to be more of the rural places. And I thought about that, Chuck, in light of maybe the cultural dynamics in our nation over the last 100 years or so, and how that's almost reversed, how Christianity is almost much more of a rural, conservative, reactionary cultural ethos, and the cities are now moving into this secular golden age. And how interesting is that? And when I read that and thought about that, I asked myself, well, what happened? What was the historical aftermath? And unfortunately for Augustine's day, the people in North Africa of Augustine's day, well, by the time we get to the end of Augustine's life, the Roman Empire is collapsing. And in fact, it's quite possible that Augustine was killed as a result of Germanic invading tribes that had come to North Africa. We know for sure that Germanic tribes had come to Augustine's area in North Africa the year of his death. Now, we don't know that he was killed in any particular this situation or that. But the point was this flowering of Roman culture in North Africa really set for like one generation or so. And so I'm thinking here of like a 50, 60, 70-year window where it was just exploding. And then all of a sudden, great changes. And so in my thinking, are we in that situation now in the West? Meaning, for me, I'm thinking primarily the English-speaking world. Are we getting set in this new secularism only to have 50, 60, 70, 80 years of this secular march, this French Revolution 2.0, as it were, only to have the next wave of societal upheaval come out of it? That was an interesting thought for me, Chuck. I don't have a resolution. I will say this. There is, as a student of history, there seems to be something quite concerning about large societal swings in almost any direction. And I'll explain what I mean. You have the Greek culture in the East sweeping through under Alexander the Great and conquering the Middle East. And, you have this 600, 800, almost 1,000 years of Greek culture in the Middle East. And then you get to the 500s, the 600s, and that sophisticated cultural ethos that produced Alexandria, that produced all of the Greek learning in the Middle East, was swept away in the rise of Islam at the beginning of the 7th century in the 600s. And, Chuck, I don't have a crystal ball. I don't have some amazing insight or knowledge here of how it must turn out. But somehow I do feel like you were saying, there is a sweep of history happening here. And there are probably some reasons why, like you say, this postmodernistic secular ethos may not really survive through a cultural transformation. So with that in mind, I just want to throw it back to you to maybe build on that if you have some thoughts or want to react to that in any way.
Yeah, it is really interesting to think about. One of the interesting things about Augustine's era, of course, is that there were outside forces that really had a big impact on that were not necessarily, it wasn't merely or really much about the battle of ideas. It was actually about the battle of nations and tribes and things like that. And so that what make and I think as you look back at history, in the end, even when conquerors try to use the argument that they're just bringing better ideas to the world, realistically, wars and those kinds of things aren't really about ideas so much as they are about sometimes they're about defending ideas. On defense they may be, but offensive wars are not. They're about power and they're about getting what you want for your people or your tribe or whatever it is. Now even as recently as maybe I don't know, 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, we might have thought, yeah, and that's not going to happen in this era, right? We thought that while there were things we were concerned about, the rise of Islamic fundamentalism, perhaps the rise of Putin, we thought that, but we're still, we're in a much more peaceful age, and what we're going to have to do is fight these rearguard actions in backward places, like like Afghanistan, or certain parts of the Middle East, Iraq, or a few other places like that. But I do think one of the things that we've seen is that perhaps we shouldn't be so confident of that. I think the war in Ukraine certainly is much more than some of the other wars going on. Is one that I think ought to worry us about that. In areas where there isn't war yet, I still think China is something that we have to think about, and what's going to come next with them. And so what that means is that perhaps if there are huge changes that lead to sort of this total displacement, as we had after the time of Augustine, after late antiquity, into what we call the Dark Ages, even though we now realize they weren't quite so dark, but still, were a major time of upheaval. It may be, if that happens, it's going to be the result of other things other than just simply ideas about postmodernism or secularism or rationalism or whatever. That said, when wars and rumors of wars come, as we know will, until the end of time, until Christ returns, there is always the possibility that those kinds of upheavals will, they will. I mean, there's not just a chance. Those kinds of upheavals, when they happen, are going to have a major impact in a way that we can't necessarily predict. And so there is a sense in which, as Christians, we need to be prepared for that as well. And some of what we're doing here, it's not to put down what we're doing here as far as sort of dealing with more the intellectual history and philosophical issues, because I think they're important. We need to talk about those things, and and hopefully some of these ideas are preserved. If Canticle for Leibowitz actually takes place, I hope that somewhere in a cave we can find Bavinck's 4 volumes of Reformed Dogmatics. But there is a sense in which that just as, or even more important now, is going to be we as Christians really just simply preserving the heart of what it is to be a Christian, the heart of what it is to be a God follower, and that, and when we look at the history of Christianity, I think we see that's how Christianity made it through those difficult times, the barbarian invasions and things, right? When the barbarians invaded, it was the Christians who stayed and helped their neighbors, and as a result had an impact on those barbarians who are our forefathers. I think you and I, probably most of our forefathers are those barbarians. Or later on, when there were, when things had fallen and gotten really bad, and then you have plagues and you have famines. What happened was Christianity, as sort of as an everyday Christianity, doing what it is that God has called us to do with and for our neighbors, is what preserved Christianity. And so there is a sense in which, again, now this doesn't mean, in some ways I'm going to tie this now back to the knowledge of God, which is that we need to spend time with revelation, with the way that we come to know God and come to know his will for us, because in those inevitable upheavals, whatever they might look like, maybe they won't be major wars. I don't know. It's hard to predict. But we as Christians have to be prepared regardless of where those kinds of things go. So yeah, that's kind of the thinking that I came to, and sort of in reaction to your comments as well.
Chuck, I think one of the things that is so striking to me about this transition, this inversion that we're talking about, is how enduring some of the inverted elements have been. Let me explain. On 9/11, the morning that the planes crashed into the World Trade Center, I was driving to work when I heard on the radio the first plane had hit. I went into work, and at my office, they had set up a television that was covering the news coverage of the situation. And I saw the second plane come and hit on that TV with my coworkers. And my coworkers were standing around, and they were just, everybody's jaw had dropped. And when that second plane hit, Chuck, I walked out of work. I went to my car. I got into my vehicle. I went to the local ATM, and I just withdrew all the cash that it would give me. Now, I don't want to make it sound, like I went and withdrew $170 billion. I mean, I literally think it was maybe $300. But the point was, I was like, is this the end? Was this kind of situation going to cause this sort of societal collapse, this apocalyptic situation? And I think the answer is it could have been. I've had people say that had that strike occurred just a few years earlier, apparently there was some specialized equipment related to centralized banking and whatnot in computer centers in the World Trade Center, that might have actually been a very significant economic discontinuity. Well, praise God, Chuck, it wasn't. Praise God, we were able to move forward. And in the midst of that uncertainty, life went on, and we were able to continue to function. What's my point? How does it relate to this? Well, it seems like people are very bad at predicting which straw is going to break the camel's back, as it were. I certainly thought 9/11 had that potential, and I was starting to take steps, baby steps, to try to do what I could for my situation. Now, in this swing to secularization in our land and in the Christian West in general, I just want to say a couple of things that have happened in recent decades that have surprised me how tenable the untenable has turned out to be, at least for a time. And so one of the things that has shocked me my entire life, Chuck, is modern monetary theory. Now, modern monetary theory is sort of this just-in-time liquidity, and it came about to try to avoid some of the bank runs and the systemic banking situations that the country would face in the times of crisis. But the downside to MMT is that you print money that you have no intention of repaying. And Chuck, I remember the budget deficits in the 1980s. I remember the battles for the heart and soul of the government over whether or not we were going to run and have a $200 million deficit. And I remember people just flipping out and thinking that is so unthinkable that we could just spend in such a way. And now today we're at $34 trillion plus. Chuck, I have no special insight. The The chairman of the Federal Reserve has not called me up for counsel in these matters. But I wonder, it's 50 years later, does anybody think that there's actually an intent to repay? If so, who lends money to a borrower who has no intent to actually repay? Now, I don't mean to get political with this. I just mean to point out, Chuck, that something that seemed so untenable in the 1980s has held on for 40 years. Now, it's gotten much worse, but the point was the people who were predicting it was going to unravel in the 1980s have been wrong for decades. And yet, there's still this fundamental question: how can such a thing be? And so this goes to the idea of tenability. I think a second thing that has shocked me is the success postmoderns have had in redefining the dictionary. You and I talk about how the language we use today has been conditioned by postmodernism. Words now have meaning today that they did not have 40 years ago, 50 years ago, and not simply words at the fringe. You know, words like woman, words like gay, words like democracy, words like doctor. They're all being redefined right in front of us. The postmodernists said we could do so. And the traditionalists like myself said, no, you go into such a terrible danger when you change things and you change the foundations of the culture. And yet, Chuck, it's been so many decades, and it almost feels like the postmodernists should have some sort of vindication. Eternal principles versus situational truths. Chuck, you and I, our whole lives, we've been impressed in our Reformed tradition with this idea of timeless truths. And frankly, in terms of competitive advantage in the cultural context, situationships, for lack of a better word, have really proved to be more advantageous. Christianity has not been defeated, except perhaps because something better, at least in this time period, this time frame, something better has come about. Wow. The emergence of identity. You know, Chuck, when people started having these intense discussions about what is a woman, what is a man, I honestly never thought things would get so advanced to the point where the ideas about identity being defined by your psychological state and by your own identification and confession. I never thought it would get to this place. Will it continue? Well, the postmodernists today, over this time frame, seem quite victorious, and we Christians seem a little bit backward, behind the times, scratching our heads. We were just telling everybody, this is all going to fall apart if we change the dictionary, if we change reality, if we change the healthcare system, if we change this, if we change that. And yet it's happened in my lifetime. One or two more things, my friend. Hypersexualization. Your grandchildren, if they do come in the next decade, will come into a culture that is orders of magnitude more hypersexualized than you and I came into 50, 60 years ago, for better or for worse. And Chuck, I'm at a loss to think that it's better in general. But, you know, if you would have told the people 50, 60 years ago just how hypersexualized everything in the culture would have gotten, I'm sure they would have just said, no, there's no way that that's going to be. And yet, here it is. And then one more, Chuck. and thank you for being patient with me here. I am shocked. I'm shocked at the success of demagogues. I'm shocked at the success of reputation destruction as a cultural weapon. You know, one of the things that's always been off my radar, off my limits, I've never wanted to defeat my opponent in the cultural wars by slander, by destroying their reputation, by telling lies and gossiping about them behind their back. And Chuck, if I can just say it from a realpolitik point of view, you know, we just lost Henry Kissinger here, but from a pragmatic utilitarian point of view, realpolitik and this politics of personal destruction and cancel culture has been wildly successful. And so, Chuck, all of these things just to point out, this really is a different world we're in today than Professor Bavinck was in, and it's even a different world that you and I came into 50 plus years ago. What do you think about that?
Yeah, you know, I mean, you've highlighted a number of things, and you know, I can't necessarily disagree with any of them. And then the question becomes, what do we do with it, right? And where does it go? And I still then, for me, where can I go, but into the arms of a graceful God, who, you know, allowed his son, you know, who is fully God, to become incarnate, to enflesh himself among the mess that we have in this world, and in doing so, to, you know, pay the price, to atone for all of that sin, all which all comes from human rebellion, to atone for that sin, and then to offer to make us one with him, regardless of the fact that we are not deserving of any of that. And that's about all I can do. And thank God that is all we can do, because, you know, there's certainly, you know, when we look back at the history of humankind, there's certainly no evidence that we can do any better anywhere else. So to some extent, that's my immediate reaction. Now, you know, obviously, I think we have to go beyond that, and we want to talk a little bit more about how does this tie in to what we've been talking about. And I think there, certainly we have a role as Christians, first of all, in pointing out the problems in our society, and pointing out where, you know, we're running into problems because of these things. And in fact, just as Bavinck does in this section that we just discussed, where he, to some extent, really turns these atheists on their heads, these atheists that hardly existed but were growing in his era, turns them on their heads. I think to some extent we have some role to do that in our culture as well, and to turn things on their heads by showing, you know, where things are going. And I do think that there is a sense in which, you know, we talked about this to some extent with regard to Bavinck's understanding and his statement that in many ways, absolute atheism is unthinkable, because while people may practically be atheistic, there is still a desire for some kind of power, whether that power is deistic. It's God, even if it's not recognized as such. And I think we can use that to address a lot of those issues. Now, that doesn't mean that you know, we can't put to ourselves and to our theological and philosophical discussions, you know, we can't say, well, we're going to be responsible for the conversion of the world back to Christianity. because only the Holy Spirit can do that. But I do think we need to be continually doing those things that the Holy Spirit can use to convert, to change, to bring about God's will, and to be servants and of that kingdom, of that upside down kingdom that we know at some point when Christ returns will be made fully present. But for now, we're just working towards. So yeah, it's important stuff, and we have to recognize it, and we got to keep talking about this stuff. We got to keep talking about the knowledge of God so that we can get there. But yeah, that's where I go from this discussion, and maybe because I don't know what it is. I think I've said before here that people have occasionally accused me of being a little bit of a Pollyanna. And even when people seem to be acting really terrible, I'm always seeing the positive there. And somebody once said to me, "You're a Calvinist. Why? How can you possibly be that way? Don't you believe in depravity?" And I'll admit that I've occasionally sort of joked about, "Oh yeah, I'm a Pollyanna. I just can't see reality." But my pastor and friend recently said to me, says, "You say that you're kind of a Pollyanna, but I've decided that what that is that you have a hope, a true hope that is based on the only true knowledge that we can have, which is the knowledge of God and the knowledge of His grace and what He's done for us." And now I hope that's true. I also recognize in myself that I'm still totally affected by that depravity, and but I think that's the thing, and I think as Christians we need to hold on to that hope, a hope that we have, because hope isn't just about, oh, I hope, but I don't think it's going to happen. It's not like right now Washington Husky fans hoping that they can still beat Michigan even though they're down by a touchdown in the fourth quarter. It's a hope that is based in truth and true knowledge and true belief and absolute conviction that God will do what He has set out to do. And that's really what true hope is. I don't know whether it'll happen soon. For all I know, we're going to go through 2,000 years of all sorts of terrible stuff, and there will only be remnants of Christians. We know that Christianity won't be destroyed because God has promised that. But maybe, we'll go through some really tough times where there's only remnants places. I don't know. Or maybe, we're on our, maybe there's a turnaround coming. Well, I'm hopeful that turnaround is coming. I'm hopeful that it's coming because Christ is returning soon. But barring that, I'm still hopeful that God will work through His Spirit in this world in preparation for the next.